now.
Test 1, 2, 3.
Welcome everyone to this month's Azure Security Meetup. This week we have with us Clancy Whittle from Arinco, and when we talk about security being everyone's responsibility, Clancy's really one of those people who envisions and leads that process. Coming from a development background, he works in his own teams and in customer teams to really focus on designing and building secure solutions. But I won't talk too much to that myself. I might hand over to Clancy and let him take it away for us.
Great. Thanks, James. So, yeah, hi everyone. My name's Clancy, and today I'm going to be presenting to you on securing serverless and PaaS services in Azure. So, a little bit about me. I'm just going to have to bring up the right thing here. Sorry. I'm a consultant working with Arinco, and I'm an application developer at heart. But really, I love all things Azure. I work a lot with app services, function apps, service bus and API management, and Azure DevOps. And if any of you are interested, Arinco are hiring at the moment. So if you're interested in working with us, please feel free to reach out to me or James or anyone else on LinkedIn, and we'll be happy to have a chat to you about working with us at Arinco. So you might be asking, why am I giving this presentation today? So imagine for a moment that you've recently adopted Azure and you've already migrated some of your on-prem workloads, but so far you've only used Azure's infrastructure as a service offerings. However, for your next project, you've decided you're going to build it using Azure's awesome serverless and PaaS offerings. And we all know why, because they cost less, there's less management, there's less development required, and there's a quicker time to release. But your security team, and I assume a number of you are in this place, are probably sitting there going, as a developer, your security team are going, what the heck? You know, and they'll be asking things like, aren't all PaaS services publicly accessible? How are you managing authentication? What about authorization? How are you managing application secrets? How are you securing communication between these PaaS services? And where do all the logs go? Well, today, I'm going to show you how you can address some of these concerns and securely build your PaaS and serverless apps in Azure. So what am I going to show you today? Well, first thing I'm going to show you is how to configure Azure AD authentication for Azure Functions. Secondly, I'm going to show you how to secure your Azure, how to secure access to Azure SQL with a managed identity. Next up will be how to secure an Azure SQL server with an Azure Private Endpoint. And lastly, I'm going to show you how to secure an Azure Function with an Azure Private Endpoint. So we'll endeavour to get through all of these today, but we'll just see depending on time and depending on how all of the demo, how all of my demos go. But we'll give it our best crack. So in the first demo, we're going to look at how to configure Azure AD authentication for Azure Functions. So in this demo, we're going to enable Azure AD on our Azure Function. This was going to create an app registration in Azure AD. We're then going to request, using Postman, we're going to request a token for our Azure Function app. And then lastly, we're going to call our Azure Function app with that token. So 1 second, just going to change over to the right windows, and we'll get started on that. So before we take a look at the actual at the Azure services, I'm just first of all just going to show you a little bit of Azure Function API code, and we're just going to just have a quick look at this because this is the code we're going to be using for our Azure Function to do our testing along the way to make sure everything is working. So this is a relatively simple function we've got here. It's top 5 products function, and it uses the Northwind database and gets the top five products out of that and just returns it back. It converts it into a dictionary and sends it back, but that doesn't really matter at this point in time. So a couple of things to note here: it's an anonymous level function, so its authorization level is anonymous, so it's publicly accessible. Anyone can call it at this time. It's HTTP triggered, and the other thing to notice here is we've got a connection string here where we actually have the database user ID and password all defined in the connection string. Now, this is far from best practice, but it's just here for the demo, and we're going to be looking at how we can then remove the password and credentials out of code and do this in a more secure fashion. So the first thing I'm going to show you today is we're going to jump over to Postman. And we're just going to call this function we have it deployed into a function app in Azure, and we're just going to give it a quick call just to make sure that it's working and it's returning back the results from the database as expected. So if I hit send on here, we can see here that in our response we returned back a 200 OK, and we returned back the top 5 products from this AdventureWorks database. So that all seems to be working correctly. So next we'll jump to a resource group that I have deployed, and just some existing Azure resources that I have deployed in here. Now, I'm not trying to, there's no smoke and mirrors here. All I've done is just deployed out a set of Azure resources so that during the demo, we're not sitting there waiting for these resources to deploy. Some of them can take up to 10 minutes to deploy sometimes, so it's just better to have it up and running and ready for the demo to take place. So we have our function app. We've got a SQL database and server. We have an app service plan, which is a premium app service plan, which is required for the networking configuration. We have a network interface card for a virtual machine, some storage for the function app, and a couple of private DNS zones, which we'll be using later for our private endpoint. So let's jump into how we actually go about configuring Azure AD authentication for our Azure function. So the portal actually provides a guided experience for doing this, which will do all of the required actions that we're required to perform. So if I go into my function app here, and on the left-hand side we have the authentication pane, and in here we need to hit add identity provider. Now we've provided a selection of different identity providers here. And today we're simply going to be using the Microsoft one, as this provides us the ability to integrate with Azure AD. We have the ability to create a new app registration, or we could use a pre-existing app registration that we have in our directory. And we also have options to select whether it's a multi-tenant or single-tenanted app. We're just going to make a slight change to the name here, and this is just so it doesn't conflict with the managed service identity we'll be creating for the function app later on in the demo. And here as well, under App Service Authentication settings, we can actually specify whether we require authentication or whether we're going to allow unauthenticated requests. And if we do allow unauthenticated requests, it's then actually up to the Azure Function code to be actually validating the authentication. So with unauthenticated requests, we have a few different options here which we're able to select. And considering we're building an API in this circumstance, we're actually going to be returning a 401 unauthorized in our particular circumstance. We're going to disable the token store. We're going to leave permissions as they are for now, and we're just going to hit add on that. So it may just take a few moments for this to configure. This will actually go and create an app registration in Azure AD, and then we'll actually go and add some configuration to the app service, to the function app, which will then instruct the function app to validate that there is a valid bearer token with each request to the function app. So our identity provider here now has been configured. So we're just going to make a quick couple of changes in this. We're just going to go into edit here. We're just going to remove the v2 endpoint off the issuer URL here, and we're just going to replace the allowed token audience with the address of our function app, here. Just going to hit save on that. And then once that's saved, we'll just go and make one slight change to the app registration that's been created. So if I click here, this will actually take me through to the app registration in Azure AD. And we can see here that that this is an app registration that has been configured. It's got a application ID, and it's been configured with certain specific settings, pre-existing settings. We don't necessarily need to worry about this at this time, but it's obviously a good idea to review these settings, prior to taking this to a live site. So the one change we do need to make here is actually in our expose API. We're just going to update the application ID URI here, and we're just going to update it to the URL of our Azure function, which is this one I've just pasted in here. So if I hit save on that, now that should be what we actually need to do to configure Azure AD authentication for this Azure function. So I should be able to go back to a Postman, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to validate that when we make an unauthenticated request to the function, that we're actually no longer able to access that, and we'd receive a 401. So if I hit send on this request here, we can see now that I'm returned a 401 unauthorized, and we've got a message that says you do not have permission to view this directory or page. So that's good. So the next, I'm just going to go to the next. I've got another configured request here, which is actually configured with authentication, and really it's configured with client credential, Azure AD client credential authentication, set up with the client ID and secret of a pre-existing app registration that I already have in Azure AD. It's just an app registration. There's nothing special about it, and I just have the scope set here to the URL of the Azure function that we're attempting to access with this token. So if I hit get new access token here, and that's actually retrieved an access token. I can hit proceed. See, I've got our access token here. I'm just going to hit use token on that. And now when I hit send on this request, I should see, we can now see that with a NOAA bearer token attached to the request now, I'm actually returned back the products from the API. So that all appears to be working well. So let's just jump back to the presentation for a moment, and we'll just review what's been configured in this demo. So as we could, in the demo, we enabled Azure AD authentication on the Azure Function app there. This has created an app registration in Azure AD. We've then requested a token from Azure AD with the scope set to the URL of our Azure Function, and then we've used that token to call our Azure Function and return back the results from that product endpoint. So let's move on to the next demo now. So the next demo now is we're going to look at how to secure access to Azure SQL with a managed identity. So in this demo, we're going to enable managed identity on our Azure Function. This is going to register a managed identity with Azure AD. It's going to create an identity object, and then we're going to assign the managed identity, the DB data reader role, to our Azure SQL database. Our function app is like then when we call our function app is going to retrieve a token for the managed identity, and then it's going to use that token, retrieve a token for the managed identity for the Azure SQL, and then we're going to use that token to query our Azure SQL database. So just going to jump across to the correct windows now. So the first thing we'll do in this demo is we'll just have a quick look again at the function app code. So one of the things I highlighted earlier in the presentation was that the password for the Azure SQL database is actually in code here. And so we know that this is far from best practice, and and as part of this demo, we'll actually be able to now remove that. So we can take these two lines here, and we can actually comment them out, and then we're going to take these 4 lines that I have here, and we're just going to take a quick look at them, and then we'll actually publish this out to the function app that we have running in Azure. So we can see now that our connection string, actually now only has we only have the server and the database name defined within the connection. We no longer have a user and a password defined within our connection string, and this is because we'll actually be retrieving a token. We'll actually be retrieving a token and using that token to access our Azure SQL database. And so this is effectively the magic sauce that this get access token async, which retrieves a token using the managed identity of the Azure Function for the resource database.windows.net. So if I save this, and I'm just going to publish this. Publish that, just make sure it's the right one. Publish. So yeah, just while this is publishing, the first thing we're going to do once this is published is we're going to go back into Postman, and we're just going to make a request again to our endpoint, and that's just to make sure that we're actually receive an error. So because we will not have enabled our managed identity, we shouldn't actually be able to, given the connection string we have, we shouldn't be able to retrieve any results from from this endpoint. So I'm back in Postman here. We've got our top 5 products auth, which is the same endpoint we were using before. And it's got the pre-existing bearer token that we had set before. So when I hit send on this, it may take a little while as the function. We can see now that we're actually returned back a 500 internal server error, and that's like maybe not the best error message, but it really this is because the function app can't connect to the Azure SQL database because we haven't enabled that managed identity. So let's go. Let's actually go and enable the managed identity, and then configure our Azure SQL database to use that managed identity. So back in the Azure portal here, I'll go back to the function app, and then on the left-hand pane we've got the identity. Pane, and within here we've got the system aside. So this is the system side managed identity. So we're going to hit on that and then hit save. Yes. So a managed identity, the managed identity for the Azure function actually represents the Azure function resource, and it is automatically authenticated with Azure AD. So you don't actually need to store any credentials in code, which is what we've removed from code. And it actually enables us to enable the Azure Functions resource to access a variety of different Azure resources without credentials. Without credentials, more without storing credentials in our code or configuration. So that that managed identity has been enabled now. Now let's go to the database, and we'll just enable we'll enable the database. We'll enable the managed identity access to read from the Azure SQL database. So into the Azure SQL database here, I'm just going to open up the query editor window. I'm going to I just need to whitelist my IP here. And then I'm going to continue. This, when you execute this command, it needs to be executed from a login that is authenticated using Azure AD itself. So I need to use my own Azure AD. I need to log in using my own account using Azure AD. So the command we hear is we're going to create a user called Azure AD Secure Func, and this is actually the name of our Azure function, and with the name of our Azure function managed identity. And we're going to add that Azure DIY Secure Func user to the DB data reader role within the database. So if I hit run on here, it says 0 rows affected, but that should have actually performed those steps, and we now should be able to. Our Azure function should be able to retrieve a token using its managed identity and call through to the Azure SQL database. So going back to Postman here, in the same request that we had before, I'm just going to hit send on this. Taking a little while. And we can see here now that we're getting a 200 OK. We've resolved that 500 internal server error, and we're now returned back the products from that top 5 products endpoint. So let's go back to the presentation. We'll review what we've configured in this demo. So in this demo, we enabled managed identity on our function app here. This is registered managed identity in Azure AD. It's created an identity object. We've then assigned that managed identity to the DB data reader role in our Azure SQL database. Our Azure function, when we called it, has retrieved a token for the managed identity from Azure AD, and it's actually used this token to query the Azure SQL database. So that's that demo. Let's jump across to our next demo. So in this demo, we're going to look at how to secure an Azure SQL Server with an Azure Private Endpoint. So in this demo, we'll take our Azure SQL Server. This should be server. Sorry, it's a bit of a mistake in my presentation. We're going to disable internet access from this. We're going to deploy a private endpoint and enable access from that private endpoint. We're then going to configure Vnet integration on our function app here, and then our Azure function will be able to access the Azure SQL database by using its Azure Private Endpoint there. So let's jump over to the Azure portal and we'll start configuring this. So I'm going to go back to the resource group here. I'm going to open up the Azure DIY Secure SQL Server here. Then on the left-hand side, I'm going to open up firewalls and virtual networks. And within here, this is where we can actually configure our private endpoint and configure the firewall and network access for our Azure SQL Server. So you'll notice here that deny public network access is currently grayed out, but this will be enabled once we actually create a private endpoint. So let's go and create that private endpoint now. So we can create private endpoint here. We're going to leave the current subscription. We'll leave the current resource group that we're in. I'm going to copy and paste a name that I already have pre-configured, and this is just so I don't make any mistakes as I'm doing it. I'm going to set the location here to Australia East, which is the location of our resource group there. I'm going to hit next. And then within our resource, within this the resource step of the wizard, we can actually select which resource we're going to create a private endpoint for. So leaving the subscription the same again, the resource type here we're going to be setting to Microsoft.SQL servers, and then within our resource here we'll select our Azure DIY Secure SQL Server, and then the target sub-resource type will be SQL Server there. So in configuration, this is where we'll be configuring the virtual network we're going to connect it to. So we're going to select our Azure DIY Secure Vnet. We're going to select the subnet to be the private endpoint subnet. And then we're going to leave this integrate with private DNS zone set to yes. And then we're going to select, just make sure it's the correct, it's the correct private DNS zone we have here, which it is. And then that should be the configuration required for the private endpoint. So hit next for tags, review and create, and then we'll hit create on that. So once the private endpoint has been created, we're just going to go back to the firewall and virtual networks and just make sure that we have public network access disabled for our SQL Server. And this is just so we can make sure that our connections from our function app are going via that private endpoint, and that our SQL Server now is not publicly accessible and only accessible through its private endpoint deployed in our virtual network. This can take a little bit of time to configure, so we just have to be a little bit patient here. Right, so that's now been completed. We'll go back to our Azure DIY Secure Resource Group. And in here, we'll go back into the SQL Server configuration. We'll we'll go to firewalls and virtual networks. And here we can see that deny public network access is set to no. We'll just set that to yes. And then we're going to hit save on that. So now that the private endpoint has been deployed, let's take a quick look at the resources that have actually been deployed as part of that deployment. So we can probably the first resource to look at here is actually the private endpoint that was deployed, and we can see here that our private endpoint has been deployed into our private endpoints subnet. We have a virtual network interface card that's been created, and this is effectively the network interface card and the private IP that will represent our Azure SQL database within our virtual network. And we have our private link resource, which is actually our secure SQL server, which is the Azure resource we're exposing through a private endpoint. We'll take a quick look at the network interface card, and we can see here it's got a private IP of 10.0.0.4. And then the last thing for us to take a quick look at is within our private DNS zone here for private link.database.windows.net, we have an A record set up for our Azure DIY SQL Server going to 10.0.0.4. And then this private DNS zone is actually linked to our Azure DIY secure virtual network. So now that we've got that private endpoint, let's go back to Postman, and we're going to again attempt to connect to our Azure SQL database. But we haven't actually connected our VNet integration, so we shouldn't be able to hit this endpoint, and we should be receiving an error because we don't have connection from our function app into our virtual network. So if I hit send on here, we can get some caching on this sometimes. It just depends. Nope, so it's not on in this case. So we can see here now again we're returned 500 internal server error, and that's because we'll be attempting to connect through the public IP address of the Azure SQL server, and that public IP address now the Azure SQL server is no longer allowing access via that public IP address. So let's go and configure the virtual network integration for our function app so that our function app is able to access our Azure SQL database via its private endpoint. So back into the Azure portal now and into our function app here. On the left-hand side, under settings, we have the networking pane, and then within the networking pane, we're going to configure in our outbound traffic, we're going to configure VNet integration. We're going to add a VNet here. We're going to leave it in this Arinco subscription. The virtual network will be our Azure DIY Secure VNet. We're going to create a new subnet. The subnet name will be web. It's going to be in the standard address block, and I'm just going to copy and paste a subnet address block here, and it's just the next logical subnet address block within our virtual network address block. We'll hit OK on that, and we'll wait for that to configure. We then need to go and make one configuration setting on the Azure function, and that's to route all traffic via the VNet. And this is because at the moment we're relying upon Azure DNS, and the Azure DNS IP address is actually in the public range. If you were doing this in a real world scenario where you had ExpressRoute configured, this would generally be not necessarily required, as you would have you'd have a private IP address for your DNS address. So that's now configured in Vnet integration. In configuration on the app service, we need to add a new application setting. We've got this website Vnet route all, and we're just going to set the value of that to 1. Hit OK, and then hit save, continue. This can take a little bit just to configure. Once this is done, we'll then just use the console of the function app just to validate that the function app will resolve the name of our Azure SQL Server to its private IP address. So going down to the console here, and we can actually, I'm going to paste in a command here, which is using name resolver and then the FQDN of our Azure DIY secure SQL Server. So I'm just going to hit enter on that, and all going well. Taking its time today. I'm just going to, clearly it's not deciding to play ball today. I'm just going to restart the function app here, and we'll run that command. We'll run that command again. Console name resolver. We're not getting. It's not playing ball for me today. We should see in this anyway that we're now returned back the private IP address of our function app, but clearly doesn't seem to be working. Let's jump into Postman and let's actually check to see whether our internal server error on here has now been resolved, and we can actually the function app itself is able to connect through to the private endpoint of our Azure SQL database. So if I hit send on here, and we can see here now that we are returned. So that error we were receiving before we configured the Vnet integration has been resolved, and we can actually connect through to our Azure SQL server via its private endpoint, and we're able to retrieve the product data from the database. I've got to give this one more try. I'm not sure that it's going to make any difference. Yes, here we go. Very good. So now we can actually see that we return back the private IP address of the Azure SQL server from so we can see that this is now within that private address space there. So that appears to have been configured correctly. So let's just jump back to the presentation. We'll have a quick review of that. So in this demo, we took our Azure SQL server. We created a private endpoint for it. We disabled public internet access to our Azure SQL server. We then took our Azure Function. We configured Vnet integration for our function, and then that enabled our function to then access the Azure SQL server via its private endpoint. So we'll move on to the last presentation that I've got today, and it's a relatively short demo. This demo will be how to secure an Azure function with an Azure Private Endpoint. So in this demo, we're going to actually take the function app itself. We're going to we're going to deploy a private endpoint for our function app. And this will actually disable internet access. So it's an on or off setting with function apps. You can't have a private endpoint and allow access from the internet. We're then going to take a virtual machine that I have deployed into our virtual network, and we're going to validate that we can access our Azure function from that virtual machine. So I'll jump back across to the Azure portal now. And we'll go into our Azure Function app, which we're already in. We'll go into networking again, and then in our inbound traffic pane here, we're going to go to private endpoints. We're going to click Add. I'm going to copy and paste the name just from my notes, just to make sure I get it right. And then we're going to select our virtual network, which will be our Azure DIY Vnet. We're going to select the subnet to be our private endpoint subnet, and we're going to leave integrate with a private DNS zone set to yes. And this will just use the private DNS zone within our resource group. So I'll hit OK on that, and we'll wait for that to deploy. So while it's deploying, it's again just worth noting that once you have a private endpoint deployed for your function app, it in effect it disables public access. So it's not something where you can have a private endpoint deployed for a function app and still be able to connect from its public from the internet. So yeah. And so once this is deployed, I'll just take another quick look at the resources that were deployed into our resource group and how that configuration is set up. It'll be relatively similar to our Azure SQL Server, but the resource that the private endpoint will be configured for will be our Azure Function resource. We'll then go to Postman and just validate the publicly we can no longer actually connect to our function app, and then we'll connect into our virtual machine and validate that we can connect from within there. So this private endpoint has been deployed now. So we'll go back to our resource group. Just going to hit refresh on that, make sure it's got everything there. So we can see here now that we have we've now got a network interface card here, and this is the network interface card of the private endpoint. We can see here that it's got a 10.0.0.5 address. We've got our private endpoint for the Azure Function, and if we go in here, we can see it's been deployed into the private endpoints subnet. It's connected. It's got a reference to that network interface card. And its private link resource is the name of our Azure Function there. And again, similar to before, we have a record in the private link.azurewebsites.net. We have a couple of A records, one for the function and one for the Kudu console, and they're both set up for 10.0.0.5. So that's all we really need to do to configure the private endpoint for the function. So let's go and test that we can no longer access our function app from the internet. So back into Postman here, just this endpoint we've been using for the demo. I'm just going to hit send on that. And we can see now that we get a 403 forbidden and this is with a website unavailable. So we're no longer able to connect to our function app from the internet. So let's see if we can test it from our virtual machine. So I'll go back to the Azure portal and I'll go to our virtual machine here. And I'm going to connect, using Azure Bastion. So Azure Bastion allows us to connect to an Azure virtual machine without actually opening up the RDP ports on the internet. So I'm just going to just copy and paste in my username and password here. I'll hit connect on this, and it should bring up virtual machine. And so we can see in here, I've just logged into the virtual machine to prepare it and not sit there waiting for a few minutes as we do it. And we can see we've got a virtual machine. I've got Postman open here. Again, I'm opened up to the top 5 products auth. I will have to get a new token on this one. So I'm just going to hit get access token on here. And that's got us an access token here. We'll just hit use token on that. Now I can't actually test from the Postman because the way that Postman handles requests. So what I need to do here is I just need to go to code, and I can actually select PowerShell down here, and we can copy and paste our request. Whoops! I'll just hit the copy button. Copy the request here. I can paste this into PowerShell, and what we should see is that we're now returned back the top 5 products from our function app. So we can just do a quick ping of our address. Do a quick ping of our address here. And we'll just make sure that this resolves to the internal IP address that we're expecting. So we can see here now that when we're connecting to our function app, we're connecting through its private endpoint, which is set up as 10.0.0.5. So I'll just jump back to the presentation. Now we'll just review what we did, and that'll finish up those demos. So in this demo, we took our function app here, we deployed a private endpoint for our function app. We disabled in doing so, we disabled internet access to our function app. We then took our virtual machine, connected to our virtual machine, and then validated that we were able to connect through to our function app via its private endpoint. So yeah, so that's pretty much all I have to show to you today. But I do have a GitHub repository here where I've got some reference materials for some of the demos that I went through today. But yeah, that's pretty much what I've got to show you today. So thank you everyone for coming along, and yeah, cheers.
Thanks so much, Clancy. I know I definitely went through a whole bag of popcorn watching that, so that was great. Couple questions from the audience. Obviously, great presentation, inspires good questions. The first one's around some app service settings. So that one is: have you ever tried using the website_DNS_server setting? The documentation says to use it, however, it doesn't seem to be required. Just wondering if you have used it.
Look, I have used that setting sometimes. But most of the time when I do this, I would generally be setting that website DNS server setting on the virtual network itself, so that the DNS server settings would be getting applied to any of the app services within that. But you can set that website DNS server setting if you want to be in control of that specific service circumstances.
Yeah, so it might be a bit more useful if you wanted some fine-grained control in a kind of edge case scenario.
Exactly. If you had a particular app service or function app that you wanted to use a different DNS server, then that's a completely valid use case for doing so. Yeah.
Yep. Another question we had was: since the private endpoint is defined for a function app, there's no. Is there any IP restrictions required for the function apps to be blocked from the public?
No, and well, no, not that I understand. So it really is once you create that private endpoint, as we saw, I just created the private endpoint, and then the public internet access from the internet was disabled. Now, at what point is it actually disabled is probably I'm not actually 100% sure, but there was no requirement for me to add once I had that private endpoint enabled. There's no requirement to add in any IP restrictions for public IP addresses.
Yeah, beautiful. I suppose one that popped into my mind is if with obviously having the private endpoint, it's great for exposing probably to an internal service, right? If you had something private endpointed and you then wanted to put it out to the public, I suppose how would you consider doing that securely? Like, is that via a separate service?
Yeah, so I mean that's a really good question, and it actually leads on to some of the other kind of places I think that you could start extending some of this work, which is really around looking at services like API management, where you could be publishing these APIs to API management, and then actually exposing that API management through something like Application Gateway or Front Door or one of these other Azure services. So there's like this. I think we've started with the real kind of base layers here of some of these PaaS services, but as like you can start expanding this out and just really improving the security layer by layer as you go through this. So yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, a big thank you from myself, Clancy. Good to have you on board. Good to have you through. I'm probably lucky, right? I get to work with you all the time, so get to see the skill in action. For those of you watching, the next event we are running will be in October. We're having one of the lovely folks at Microsoft come through to talk through some more Sentinel Defender stuff. That should go up shortly, and you'll get a notification on the page when that does go up. But until next time, a big thank you for tuning in, and a big thank you to Clancy for coming out.
Thanks for having me, James, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming along.
Absolute pleasure. Talk soon, everyone.